Hello and welcome to part 3 of my commission work, painting miniatures from the game Sword and Sorcery. Today I'll take a look at one of the hero miniatures, namely Auriel. I was thinking of painting her up with some dark skin and bright colored clothing to hopefully make a nice contrast between the two. I've done my best to remove mold lines and the model is now ready to be primed. I'm going to use Corax White. I'll be right back once the model has been undercoated. The model has been primed and we are ready to paint. I'll start by painting the skin, and I'm going for a darker skin color than usual. So I'll start with a base coat of Night Quester flesh. I've taken 2 drops of paint and 3 drops of water. And as always, 2 thin coats are better than 1 thick one. Let's begin. Following that base coat, it's time to add a shade, and I'm using Raglan Flesh Shade. However, I'm going to thin it down a little, but not using water, I'm using Lamian Medium. Water and washes tends to be a little blotchy when applied to the model. So I'm mixing it in a 1-to-1 ratio. Roughly 1-to-1. When you've mixed it well together, just apply it all over the skin. I've given the shade plenty of time to dry, and now you can see we have some nice definition on the skin. Now I'm going back to my previous mix of Night Quester flesh to add a layer on the model. So essentially paint everything that isn't a crevice or a recess. The last thing I want to do with the skin is to add a highlight of Cadian flesh tone, just to the very edges, such as knuckles and her nose and ears, those things. I've used 1 drop of paint and 2 drops of water for this. And with that highlight, I'm calling the skin complete. The next thing I want to paint is her cape, and I want to paint it blue, so I'm starting with the base coat of Cantor Blue. And I'm using a roughly 1-to-1 mix of paint and water. Just cover the entire cape. The base coat is dry, so now I add a shade of Dragonhof Nightshade. I'm not going to thin this down, just add it all over the cape. I gave the shade plenty of time to dry, and as you can see now we got a very nice dark blue color, which is perfect for our shadows. Next I'm going to add a layer of a lighter blue. I've added 1 drop of paint to 2 drops of water. And what you want to do is essentially paint it on everything that isn't a recess. Like so. Just a quick note, I don't show it on camera, but always shake your paints well before using them. The layer is complete and we are ready to add a highlight, and I'm using Hoeth Blue. I'm using the same mix of 1 drop of paint to 2 drops of water. And what we want to do is paint all the edges and the most raised areas on the cape. Like so. I've finished highlighting the model. If you want to take it a step further, you can add a dry brush of Ethereum Blue. And with this I would only focus on the edges and the most prominent raised areas. Just very gently. That's a very subtle highlight. The next step is completely optional. If you think the highlight is a bit too bright, you can always tone it down with some Goleman Blue. Well, the Games Workshop doesn't produce this product anymore, which is why I'm saying this is purely optional. But it helps tone down the colors a bit and bring them all together. Just add it all over the cape. When the paint is dry, the blue cape is complete. However, there are some, I think there are Fleur-de-Lys on the cape, but we'll paint those later. Next, I'm going to paint her hair, and I want it to be black. So I'm starting with a base coat of Abaddon Black. Just paint it all over, but be careful not to hit the cape or the skin. And as always, 2 thin coats are better than 1 thick one. Following that base coat, I'll add a shade of null oil. Just all over the hair. The shade is dry, so now I can add a layer, or a white highlight is probably more accurate. I'm using Etching Grey, and I have taken 1 drop of paint to 2 drops of water. If you want to, you can dry brush this on, but I prefer to have more control over my paint. So what I'll do is just follow along the strands of hair and paint them Etching Grey. I've finished applying the Etching Grey, so I'm ready to move on to the next step. And for the next step I will be using a dry brush, because I'm using Dawnstone. And I'm just making a very light dry brush. Just be sure to catch the most raised areas, and be careful not to hit the cape or the skin. When that's done, I'll add a final dry brush of Longbeard Grey. And this time I'm focusing only on the end of the hair. And with that, the hair is complete. Next, I would like to paint her boots and her wrist armor. And I'm starting with a base coat of Baragnar Burgundy. The paint is dry and she's looking ladylike already. Next, I'm adding a shade of null oil. When the shade is dry, it is time to add a layer. However, I think I'll do it a little different this time. Instead of just simply adding a layer, I will use glazes instead. A glaze is really just a fancy term for a paint that has been heavily thinned with water. For this stage, I'll use Pink Horror. I will take 1 drop of paint to 4 drops of water. This will make the paint very thin and transparent. What you want to do is to apply it like a layer, but apply it only once, let it dry, and then apply it again. With that method you have more control over the strength of the color, as opposed to just adding a layer. This method takes longer, but as I've said, it gives you more control. Every layer you make will make the color stronger. Just continue to add a layer, let it dry, add another layer until you're satisfied with the result. The paint may act a little like a shade, so be careful it doesn't run into the recesses. What you can do is wipe about 50% of the paint off on a tissue before you paint. This also gives you more control as you paint. The important thing is you have fun with it. I ended up using 5 layers to get a strong color. The next step is to add a highlight of Slanish grey. On all the edges. And with that, the boots and the wrist armor is complete. Next I would like to paint what little clothes she's wearing. And for that I'm starting with the base coat of Mephiston Red. When the paint is dry, it's time to add a shade, and I'm using Carabet Crimson. When the shade is dry, it's time to add a layer. I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet. If you wish, you can use it as a glaze instead, like I showed you previously, but I'm just trying to keep this as simple as possible. And finally I'll add a highlight of Wild Rider Red. Following that I'm going back to Mephiston Red, because now I want to paint all those flowers on her cape. And I'm using an insane detail brush for this. Just very gently and very carefully base coat those flowers. Just take your time with them. I finished painting the symbols, but they look kind of flat. So now I'm going back to Wild Rider Red and add a highlight, just to make them stand out more. On her right hand she has a jewel inserted into her wrist armor. And I'm starting with the base coat of Stormhost Silver on that one. Following that I'll cover the silver with Spirit Stone Red. When that's dry, I'll add a tiny dot of Scar White on top of the jewel. And lastly, I'll cover the jewel with Art Coat to really make it shine. Next up I want to paint the staff she's holding. I'll use Incubate Darkness as a base coat. and I'm also using a regiment brush. However, if you are feeling a little uncertain, then you can use a smaller brush for this. I'm painting the entire staff except the head. Just be very careful when you get near the cape. Following that base coat, I'll add a layer of Capellite green. When the Capellite green is dry, I'll add some super red green highlights for good measure. Next up, I would like to paint the head of the staff, and I'm going to use a contrast paint, so I want the paint underneath to be as bright as possible. So I'm starting with a base coat of white scar. When the white scar is dry, I'll add a contrast of Pilar Glacier. I'll add this all over the staff head. Apply a second coat if you want it to be stronger. When the contrast paint is dry, I'll finish it off by adding a dry brush of Praxetti white, just on the edges. When the staff is complete, there is only the shoulder pad and necklace left, and I'm painting them gold. So start with a base coat of Retributor armor. Following that base coat, I'll add a shade of Raglan Flesh Shade. However, I'm not shading the necklace. The shade is dry, but the gold has been darkened quite a bit, so I'm going back to Retributor armor to add a layer. And finally, I'll add some edge highlights of Liberator Gold. I've finished painting the miniatures, now it's time to do the base. The first thing I'll do is paint it black with Abaddon Black. Just all over. Be careful not to hit the model itself. When the Abaddon Black is dry, I'll then add some art coat over the surface of the base. Make sure you give this plenty of time to dry. I would say about 20 minutes. The art coat is dry, so now I'll grab an old brush I don't really care for and some modern earth and apply it to the surface of the base. This will take several hours to dry. I've given the paint plenty of time to dry. Next, I would like to add some astrogranite, preferably in places where the cracks are small, just to add some texture. like so. Do it various places around the base. With the astrogranite completely dry, I'll paint over it with Abaddon Black. When that's dry, I'll add a shade of null oil all over the base. Give it plenty of time to dry. With the shade completely dry, it's time to add a couple of dry brushes, and I'll start with a heavy dry brush of Dawnstone. The last thing I'll add to the base is another dry brush of Rag White. However, this time I'm going about it very lightly. The miniature is now complete. The final thing to do is to add a varnish, so my client can play with his miniature. I'm using AK Interactive's Ultra Matte Varnish. However, I am diluting it a little with some contrast medium. What you want to do is paint this all over the model except on metal areas. I'm mixing this at a roughly 1:1 ratio. Mix it well together. And finally, apply it to the model. And when you're finished, give it about 20 minutes to dry. Maybe a little less even. Auriel is now ready to see some action in the world of sword and sorcery. I hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial and maybe even got inspired to pick up a brush yourself. If you are following along at home, then please share your work on Instagram with the hashtag #JimmyStender and I'll be sure to check it out. If you like this video and want to see more in the future, then please hit the like button and the subscribe button as well. If you want a notification when I upload, then hit the bell as well. It's totally free and helps my channel immensely. Thank you for watching. Happy painting!